Hi everyone, welcome to Casual Watch Talk Live. There was a scheduling mistake. I know it said 29th on the schedule, but we're actually going to be doing it on the 22nd. So hopefully you all saw the quick reminder there. This week we're going to be doing, I'm really excited about it, a vintage watch special. So keep your questions coming in, everything to do with vintage watches, but I'm just going to introduce my guests one by one. So first off, going to introduce Dave from Detroit Mint. Dave, thanks for joining us. Hey. And then I'm going to introduce Steve. Steve's going to help us as the all-rounder watch collector on vintage watches. And then Dave will be helping us out with vintage American watches and vintage racing watches. I'm going to introduce Josh. Josh, thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Josh is going to be helping us with vintage Hamilton, questions on vintage Hamilton. And then finally, we're joined by Todd. Todd, thank you for joining us. Todd's going to be helping us with vintage Seiko.
Hello, hello.
Hello. Well, thanks for joining, everyone. Sorry about the mix-up with the time there, but we're live now. It's going smoothly already. Well, should we kick it off with a wristwatch check? We might as well break the ice with a wristwatch check. Dave, do you want to kick us off with a
Sure.
wristwatch check?
As I'm sure a few of you know, or that I've talked about a few times, my love for vintage watches came from my father's collection. So, Dad's, this is a 1966 Zodiac Seawolf worn in Vietnam.
Oh,
This is Dad's watch. And then this is my birth year, 1971 6105 Turtle.
Awesome.
So those are very cool. I have a bunch here that I'll reference as we go through a few things, but yeah, those are the ones for today.
Awesome. Steve, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. So what I have on today is let's see if I can get it in the camera here. This is a vintage Wittenauer Professional with the Valjoux 72, which has a very, very expensive movement to get repaired. And I actually picked this up earlier this year, and it was in a non-running state, and just recently got it back from service. And I didn't intend to keep it, but I love it so much, and it's in really great condition that I'm happy to own it. And so that's what I'm wearing today.
Todd, do you want to go next?
yeah, I'll go next. So I kind of wore this hoping that Dave might be on. This is a, let's check the date again on it. This is a 1976 Seiko brown bullhead.
Nice.
Choice.
That's actually a Spencer Klein restoration. This one is.
Awesome.
So, yeah.
Okay, Josh.
I have an Apple Watch. No, I have an Apple Watch. I have, let me see if I can get it in the camera there. This is a 1972 out of focus Hamilton Dateline A594. It has the, yeah, it's super cool. Very 70s, obviously with the K shape and the color and all that. Automatic 822, sourced by ETA, of course, before ETA was ETA. So that's what I got on today.
I actually think I might have one of those.
It is original bracelet. Yeah, good eye.
Oh,
Yeah.
Yeah,
Wow.
good eye.
it's like a JB Champion bracelet.
It's exact. Wow. I guess I shouldn't be surprised with this august company that I'm in. But yes, it's absolutely a JB Champion.
Yeah, very nice.
Well, I'll round it out, and mine isn't really vintage. At least I hope not, because I can't mentally think that anything from the 90s is vintage. But I've got my 90s Breitling B1 on, so nice. I haven't. The only really vintage watch I've got other than this is my grandfather's Timex, but I don't often wear that. It's partly because I'm afraid of breaking it, and also it's a bit too small, and I don't want to take the band off and put it on NATO or anything like that, so I'll leave it. It's funny because it was my US grandfather's watch, but it was at that time when Timex made them in the UK. So it's got like made in GB on the American watch, but made in the UK.
Yeah.
So Sam, I actually have a question for you since you brought up your watch, because I was just thinking about this before we got on the call. But like, what point do you consider a watch vintage? When does vintage even start at this point? Because you just said the 90s. I mean, but that could have been 30 years ago. So when does vintage start? I'm curious what everyone else here thinks.
great first question. This is a great first question. Yeah. I don't. Do I? I don't know whether. I know vintage clothing. The vintage clothing can be like 5 years ago, can't it? Some people just think of vintage or vintage style things, or like vintage furniture. But I don't know. I guess it depends what decade you were born, because I wouldn't think anything from the 80s is particularly vintage. But then somebody I'm sure that was born in the 90s would definitely think that the 80s was vintage. What do you think, Steve?
I feel like the 90s is definitely vintage at this point. I mean,
Really?
it's 30 years. I even think, early 2000s can be vintage. I like to use the term neo vintage for stuff of that era because it's not quite vintage and it's not quite new. So I think it's kind of fits in that neo vintage category. But I mean, you think about it, 30 years, if you're in the 90s, 30 years ago would have been the 1960s. I mean, and I think if you are kind of thinking with that mindset, that would definitely be vintage. But again, everyone has a different feeling. So what do the rest of you think?
Well, I do a lot of vintage jewelry and clothing on my eBay store, and the definition is 30 years or older. So that puts us squarely into the late 80s, early 90s. So I would say 30 years, basically.
Oh.
And, that number is running. We're now up to 1991.
Well, then is antique then the next level after
50
vintage?
years or older.
Okay.
Okay.
So a lot of the watches, we're looking at from the 60s are that's
Antiques,
technically an antique because it's a 50-year-old watch, right? So some people say 100 years for an antique, but I've always heard 50 for jewelry at least, and watches are technically jewelry. So
I think cars are classic at 25 years.
right.
I can get a vintage plate for my car if it's 25 years or older.
Right.
So
what do you think? What do you think about the cutoff? Because I feel like, especially you, Todd, being into Seiko, maybe it's a little bit different because everyone kind of thinks of that sort of golden Seiko era, sort of ending around 1980.
Yeah, that's probably about right. So I was born in the 60s, so I may be the oldest guy in the room. So what's, vintage for me may be a little different. But I think you're right. To your point, I think it depends a little bit on the item itself. So Seiko had golden years in the 60s, obviously, when they started trouncing the Swiss in their own, chronometer games. And then, the 70s, of course, were a great time for them for both quartz as well as their chronographs and other things, right? Grand Seiko was starting to go up and stuff like that. So, but then you're right, 1980 is when they kind of started really dropping a lot of the work they'd done previously. So to me, but the guys on the forum say that like original SKX is vintage going back, or 6103, right? Or 6309 Diver, for example, which is newer than the one Dave has, 6105.
Right.
And so
I sold a 6309 as a vintage watch because it was made in the 80s. It was like an 84. So it classified as vintage at least on eBay. So
yeah, at least on eBay. So it's somewhere in there.
What about you, Josh? You're the professional here.
Far from it. I think I'm more in line with Todd. 1979, I think, is my hard cutoff. It was a great year to be born, I'll tell you that. And it was also, right, sort of peak quartz crisis. Hamilton had moved to Switzerland. Right. The design language has changed. Think about the aesthetic you think of when you hear 1970s, and then think about the aesthetic you think of when you hear the 1980s, right? To me, it's, there's 2 or 3 reasons why, to me, 79 and earlier is what I think of as a vintage watch. And it's interesting, I never really thought about the distinction between vintage and antique, because that's the same as well, right? They're going up through the 50s, maybe mid 50s, and then mid 50s on, to me, is sort of like, Steve, sort of what you said, like a neo vintage. There's definitely, you go from that 20s, 30s, 40s Art Deco small tank watch, everything's gold, right? And in the mid 50s, you start to see more and more stainless steel, and then you get more into the modern vintage, if that's a term, right? So to cut myself off, 1979 and before is vintage, and then it's all details from there.
Yeah, I think it also depends on when something's like when you're right, when a design paradigm changed.
Mhm.
So I have, this is a original Seiko. Here's the box. Oh, there we go.
Oh, wow.
Original Seiko box. This is an artillery timer from World War II.
Awesome.
And Seiko show, see, and so, and obviously World War II, I'm thinking is a vintage, but it's a pocket watch. So what point did the functionality paradigm change to completely make this, something different, totally different? I don't know. This
Well,
is one of the things I
so
was thinking about.
yeah, along the vintage versus antique line, as we're talking Hamilton, what about the Ventura? That's that 1950s,
Great point.
right? So that's well over 50 years old now. You're talking 70 years old.
Right.
It's electric, not a mechanical watch, or not completely mechanical.
Yeah, not totally. Yeah.
Um,
That's good. That's an interesting thread to pull on, because we talked a bit about cars earlier. Look at the car designs in the 50s. Everything It's the rocket age, right?
Mhm.
Right.
It's the nuclear age, so everything's got fins. Everything looks like a spaceship. Everything looks like a rocket ship. And sort of the Ventura, and sort of the
Right.
Pacer,
Mhm.
and so and
Basic,
to a lesser degree the Thor. Yeah, that's kind of small. Maybe I shouldn't have thrown that one in there, but it's a sign of the times, right? They really captured the general exuberance and feeling, I think, of the American atomic age, nuclear age, space age kind of thing. So that's interesting. They were trying to be futuristic, right? So it's in the
Right.
mid 50s, and they're like, let's design a watch what we think, so far in the future in the 1980s, what would watches look like? They'll look like this, and that's what they came up with.
right.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Josh, I'd
Mhm.
like to start with you, especially because this is of interest to me, but it's also a subject I don't know a lot about, and that is vintage Hamilton.
Mhm.
So I'll just give you a little plug here on your website.
Thank you.
Do you want to just give a bit of a background about what you actually do, how you source these watches, and then what happens once you buy them?
Sure. So I'll back it up just a little bit. I got into servicing and repairing watches because I'm cheap and I don't want to pay anybody to do things that I can do. I grew up changing my own oil and all that sort of stuff. And then so when I got into watches, you quickly, yeah, that's the one I have on right now. Good shot. Good shot. I'm the one who took it. Of course it's good. I didn't want to pay somebody to do things that I could do. And so when I got into watches, you learn pretty quickly that these things are, mechanical. They do have oils and greases and lubricants, and those things degrade over time, and you have to service them. They have to be serviced. I've always been mechanically inclined, so hey, let's teach myself how to service a watch. And so I went to the University of YouTube and started just watching hours and hours of YouTube videos. To answer your question directly, I source my watches from eBay. And we were talking a little bit before the show. That's a minefield, right? And especially if you're buying a watch to wear, it could be a Franken watch. Somebody less scrupulous than I might have grabbed a watch and grabbed the 2 or 3 wheels of the knee out of it, and fix another watch, and they sold this other watch. So for a lot of collectors who don't do what I do, it could be scary, right? Because you get a watch that doesn't work. So I source non-running, broken watches. I source parts, all that stuff from eBay. And then, fortunately, like with the set 1970s watches, those are usually fairly complete and really just need a cleaning. So I grab everything from eBay, and I don't know if it shows up, but I have a whole parts bin up there, whole collection, and I cleaned up my bench for the show, so everybody can see that's about as clean as it's ever been, actually. And then I just, spend a couple hours down here in the basement, cleaning parts and putting them together and looking at 80-year-old spec sheets and doing some research and putting it together.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And I know you've one area, and I'll get everybody else's opinion on this. One area that I think of that's scary about Hamilton, and we did a video probably a couple of years ago now, Josh, where we talked about this, but it seems like you've kind of got into it more now. But I think a minefield on eBay is definitely the military Hamiltons.
You got it. Yep.
Yeah.
That exactly right. They because they're so collectible, and the values, for these are a little bit higher than your typical vintage Hamilton. The sale price is a little bit higher, and as the sale price of watches goes higher, the incentive to counterfeit or franken them or be less than honorable with what you're selling online is higher. So it's definitely you have to know what you're doing to get into it. And you're right, Sam. When last we talked about it, this was something I was purposefully stayed away from. It was just something that I didn't want to risk. Right, for me, this is a hobby. I love doing it. It's fun, and I didn't want it to be stressful. And at the same time, I don't want to waste money, and I don't want to make a bunch of mistakes if I can avoid them. And so I avoided doing my research on this just because I was having so much fun, doing the other stuff. And then I got into it, and then I started doing the research. Lots of great resources out there. A lot of very particular, specific experts on the fonts and the colors. And at this year, the spec did this, and and Hamilton had this kind of four, and all of the little minutia that we all get into is all out there, right? And so I spent a couple of weeks doing that research and felt more confident getting in and placing a bid on eBay that I was comfortable with. And just like anything, if anybody buys anything on eBay, for me at least, I put a number in there that I'm comfortable with, and if I lose it, I lose it, and if I get it, I get it. And just like anything, the more you know about it, the more confident you can be with what you're purchasing. And again, I'm different, I think, for most people, because if I make a mistake on a watch, and but 90% of the watch is legitimate or okay or whatever, I've got other places to put those parts, and I could bring those parts back to life, and it's all genuine Hamilton. I'm not swapping incorrect parts and all that stuff. It's all legitimate, but it's all about research, right? And it's all about getting in the details and knowing what you're getting yourself into. And also, here's Josh Will's financial advice: don't spend more than you're willing to lose, right? I mean, because there's always that chance that you could buy a $1,000 watch that's you spend $5,000 on a fake Panerai, tough.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So that's and really that's why Hamilton really is my brand of choice. It's plentiful, it's collectible, it's American, and the barrier to entry is pretty low in terms of price.
Yeah, I'll just give you a little your YouTube channel plug as well, where if you are interested in vintage Hamilton, you can see where you've serviced some of the movements and things like that. On the one we were just looking at, that looks very clean inside. Did you replace a lot of those parts, or was it just happened to be in that good a condition? It
was in that good a condition, and that's the beauty of a water resistant, water sealed watch. If nobody's gotten into it before I've gotten into it, if the seals are generally pretty good, around the crown tube, you can expect to see that. I've seen watches, from the 30s that were, where the ratchet wheel was that clean and the bridges were that clean. It's not uncommon to see something in that good a shape. And also, when you're as highly skilled as I am, you can bring stuff back from the dead.
Well, speaking of EB, we've got a first question for you. So, David's asking here: are you able to service electric Hamiltons?
Great question, David. No. It was something I looked into. I think going back to availability of parts. From what I understand, like the 505, the caliber 505, which was their electric movement, there's particular parts that are incredibly hard to source, which means that one, they're hard to find, but two, they're also really expensive. So that's a practical answer. Also, I have zero understanding of electricity and how it works. To me, it's black magic. So even a 1.5 volt battery to me is magical. So I
So you don't want to
my
try one of these?
curiosity, yeah, exactly. Is that the pulsar? Yeah.
Yeah.
My curiosity stops at something I can see interacting with something else, and oh, that is wrong, and let me fix that. So, unfortunately, I don't do electric Hamiltons. No.
Steve, have you ever got into the military Hamilton watches?
Well, it just so happened. I mean, it's not a military one, but it's more or less the civilian version of
Yeah.
that same watch, probably from around the same era as the
Yep.
Hamilton khaki. So I got one of these. I don't know. I picked it up in a parts lot, and then I got another one not too long ago, and it sat for a long time, and then I finally decided to get it serviced, and I absolutely love it. I'm a big fan of the vintage. I guess we're calling it vintage Hamilton field watches, like from the 70s and 80s. So I think they're a really good value, but I try and stay in my lane. Like, I know what I know, and like I know that these watches here are not that expensive. Granted, it's a civilian version, so it's probably not going to sell for as much as like the model that Josh has on his website, because it's not a true military issue watch. So I totally agree. Like, do your homework, and especially if you want to get into something very specific. I mean, I think it really helps to research as much as you can to kind of understand, like, is this a legitimate watch? Is this a good deal? Has it been serviced recently? Do I trust the person that I'm dealing with? And for me, like, I really try and stay in my own lane, and not try and go out too much, because I think that there's always a risk to get burnt, and find a dud, or overpay on something, or find that you just can't find parts. That's sometimes an issue with vintage watches as well. So I love the civilian versions of those military watches, but that's kind of where my focus ends at the moment.
Yeah. Josh, you said that the parts for Hamilton are easier to get hold of. Are they these new old stock parts, or are they new parts that are interchangeable with the old movements?
The answer is yes. There's surprisingly amount of new old stock out there for most of the vintage American brands. Hamilton, Burin, Wittenauer, Belova, and Caravel, I think, was one of their brand names. I've got shoe boxes underneath the bench here of unsorted new old stock parts, right? I mean, in the little packages, and it's got the part number on it, and the whole bit. So they're easy to find. What's difficult about them is, just like me, I got a shoebox full of them, of 7 different brands, unsorted, right? So they're sitting down there not doing anybody any good. Being able to find them on eBay is a whole nother story, and that's kind of why I buy these lots. I spend whatever, $30-$40 for a couple pounds of parts, and maybe I can use 5 of them, and then I turn around and try to catalog them, and make those available for other guys like me that are spending their time in the basement in the middle of the night when they should be getting some sleep, working on watches and that sort of stuff. But so dual stock parts are surprisingly available, but I would say probably 90% of the parts that I have, again, are from buying a broken watch. I'll go spend. I don't care if it's the dial is missing, the hands are toast, and the case is shot, and if the movement's 80% complete, you bet I'm putting a bid on that. And if I get it, great. And if I don't, I don't. And and that's how you end up with a couple thousand busted watches in your basement, and your wife just shakes her head every time the UPS man puts the box.
Because Josh, Todd, this is an issue with Seiko, isn't it? Actually sourcing the parts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of the advantage you have, I think it's true with what Josh was saying too, with Hamilton and with Seiko. They sold a lot of watches, a ton out there, and the movements have some commonalities, and so depends on what they are, and so there's lots of broken watches out there. And so what I do the same thing Josh does. I I monitor eBay a lot. I monitor some other auction sites, like when we did that original podcast. When I was talking about vintage Seiko chronographs, for example, I look at different websites, and that's where I got my last watchmaker's lot, and has a ton of stuff in it. Like it has an original Seiko branded movement holder. Like, oh, this is awesome. For me to buy that, is $150 or something, and it came in there. So you get these gems. But I do the same thing. I look for watches that are grungy. I want to see wrist cheese on the back of it. I want to see decades of grunge in between the crystal and the and the outer bezel, let's say. And if it's missing parts, as long as they're not critical ones, that's fine. There's lots of new old stock, but what's funny though is that the common items now are just starting to dry up. So we're starting to see a problem with a Seiko chronograph, for example. Here's one that's really, really rare. It's only made for 2 months. It's a JDM only. It's called the Sunrise. You can't really see it. It's a teal dial one, and again, it was only made for 2 months in Japan. These are faked horribly. So if you see these on eBay, chances are it's a fake dial on a regular 60 Pogue, type of watch case here, because you can change the dials out anyone. So 6139, but the chronograph wheel, which drives this, the center chronograph, those go bad, and though new old stock are hard to find. There's an inner bezel. There's a rotating bezel. You can see as I rotate it here.
Oh, yeah.
These original interior, but they fade and they crack. So getting new old stock versions or ones in good shape, those are going for a premium. They're like $150 now for a yellow one, just for that plastic bezel. And so they make aftermarket versions, but us purists who want to bring these back 100% are still fighting for the originals. This is an original Seiko speed timer JDM bracelet, for example. So you can see it has the Seiko 5. If I can turn it right, I've got to think opposite here. Seiko 5 Sports. So, finding these now is crazy. The prices for original bracelets is hundreds of dollars, if not, many hundreds of dollars. So it's hard to, you have to really do your homework, like Josh said. And, like, for example, I have one of the Seiko speed timer book written recently by Sadeo. I always have to look at it, Ryugo. And so, he's got some interesting facts in here, but you can also go online and get the information you need. This is one that will appeal to Dave. He only put out 300 of these.
Wow.
I think he's going to do another run, but this is the history of the Seiko diver's watch.
Yeah.
And he has interviews with Hattori, the original designers in here. It's really fascinating. It's done in both Japanese and English. So, you have to also invest in the books and invest in. I have original Seiko manuals with parts and parts numbers. So when I see something online, I can go double check and see. A lot of that's available online too, but I'm old school. I like paper. So I like to leaf through paper. But anyhow, it's a bit of a minefield, and you have to really do your homework, like Josh said.
So the reason I ran off, Josh, I wanted to show you this. And get it in.
Oh, there it is.
Oh, wow.
That's gorgeous.
So
I think that's the first one I've seen in the metal. That's wow.
We're a very contemporary size.
Yeah.
All original, Dave.
It is. So I actually sent it to a watchsmith to have it redialed, because the dial the paint started to delaminate. This was sitting in the bottom of a box of broken vintage jewelry. And it was working, but not well. So I just, I took the, just a few parts off and cleaned them, oiled them, and put them back on. I didn't want to tear the whole movement apart. So, just a couple little things, and it popped back to life. It keeps pretty good time. It's probably a minute a day off, but I don't wear it that much, because I know finding parts for this, I think, would be pretty brutal. But I love it. It has, it was supposed to be a black dial, I think. but this one is definitely faded to more of like a navy blue.
Mhm, mhm.
So, and the blue and red. So yeah, this is actually my only Hamilton in my collection right now.
Oh, that's a shame.
I know. And
Although
I
if
love
that's going to
this
be your
watch.
only
I mean,
one,
this
if
thing
you're
is
going
a
to have
great
one,
watch.
yeah, if you're going to have one, that's the one. and
So,
can we just go ahead, Sam? Sorry.
No, I was just going to ask Dave because I actually reviewed a vintage Sailor watch, and I commented that I'd never seen the red and black split from. Normally, you see it across the center, don't you, for
Right.
GMT? But it's split up and down. Did you know the history of that, Dave? Why the split is from the 60 to the from the 12 to the 6? Because normally it's across the median for a GMT. I couldn't work it. I couldn't find anything about it when I did my review.
There's for diving, a typical dive is about 30 minutes, so you could use it for that. But this is a rally, right? This is technically a rally diver,
Right.
So I would say you're talking about a rally time, most likely a 30-minute rally time. So this is definitely a 1970s rally diver. I mean, that is everything you want in a rally diver. It's got the checker flag, detail on the on the dial,
gigantic markers.
Yeah. So yeah, it's a
We've
cool
got a
watch. I wanted to show you guys this one because we were
Cool.
getting in the
That's
weeds a little bit
sweet.
on Hamiltons.
yeah, we've got another question in the chat here. Jeremy says, "I'm looking at a vintage Bueller. Not a ton of information. I've never
Bucherer?
heard of that brand.
Maybe I don't know what's a Bueller. I don't know what that is.
Isn't
you heard of
that
that,
like
Steve?
a flight watch, a vintage like a flagger type?
Oh,
I think I've owned a couple, and I feel like they were just maybe a European brand, kind of like SEMA or Edox or one of these kind of
like
smaller
Cello.
European brands that maybe they didn't
Swiss
sell in
brand.
North America.
Yeah.
Jeremy's saying it's a Swiss brand.
Okay.
Yeah, I've got an Edox Panda actually that has one of the early 7750s in it. A very early 7750 and an Edox white dial, black subdial Panda. That's it's a neat, unique watch. I don't think it's not terribly popular, but I was wondering when I got it, the owner didn't know what type of movement that was in it, and I'm like, I wonder if that's it was a mechanical, not an automatic, and I'm like, is that a mechanical 775 or a 7750, or is it a an earlier one like a 7.2 or 7.4? I was like, oh, I hope it's a 7.4 inside of there, and it wasn't, but still a cool watch because those are not very common.
I think a question I've got, and probably throw it out to anyone who answers, is I'm one of those skeptics on vintage watches that I don't know enough about them, and I'm sure I would get burnt. And I know you have to kind of take a bit of a rough with the smooth when you're collecting vintage watches, but I don't know, Steve, maybe start with you. Is there any vintage watches that you would just avoid because they're either impossible to get the parts for, or they just were not very well made in the first place, so it's not really worth repairing them?
Well, yeah. So the citizens. So I found that interesting that Dave has basically recreated that watch because the originals are actually not very well made.
No.
And especially like the cases on them, they tend to it's like a base metal with a gold plating.
Case.
Yeah, and Seiko had the exact same thing, and so you look at the undersides of them typically, and it's just totally eaten away.
Yeah,
and you never see any of those in good shape. But yeah, I would say like anything with a pin lever movement, a very low grade movement that was really not made to be serviced. And a lot of them will say like lumplanus on the actual movement itself. Unusual brands as well that maybe there's not a lot of them out there because you have to remember when you're buying a vintage watch, it's just inevitable that at some point something is going to break, and where are you going to find parts for them? And so the great thing about buying a brand like Bulova or Hamilton or Seiko is that the parts are out there. I mean, they may be a little bit harder to find, but you can find them. I had a Universal Genève,
Mm.
and it was a really, really neat watch, but there were some parts for that I just simply could not get because they just did not exist. They weren't out there. And so it was a watch that unfortunately I just had to uh, sell again, resell, because I just couldn't find the parts that I wanted, that I needed in order to restore it properly. And so um, I definitely think if you want to get into vintage, start small, start cheap,
Mm-hmm.
go with something a lot more common that you're going to be able to find parts for, buy from a trusted resource. Ideally something that's been serviced fairly recently as well. And then work your way up into the stuff that's a little bit more rare and unusual. But I think if you start the other way around, you can end up, having a really bad first impression or experience.
Right. I would strongly caution people that are getting into electric watches, not quartz, but electric, like the early Hamiltons, the early electric watches. You need to have a great understanding of early circuit design to be able to service and maintain those. My early pulsars, I had to find an old electrician that actually had worked at Time Corp or whatever,
Yeah.
and another guy who worked on. They used that same quartz LED module for the early military applications in the 70s, and he was actually the guy who ended up building the module for mine. It's actually a brand new module inside mine, but it was built by a member of the Defense Department that still has to maintain those things. So I guess there's still, and it scares me to think that there's still things from the 70s that our military is still trying to maintain, but with old Time Corp quartz modules in them.
Well, the banking system runs on those AS400s, doesn't it? From these, so
That's right.
we're all hopefully. I mean, they built stuff to last, but yeah, remember Chris mentioned on one of our podcasts that those same pulsar timing modules are used inside some computers as well. I think as the timing mechanisms. But Todd, is there any? I know you sort of specialize in collecting Seiko. Is there any like specific vintage Seiko model that you just wouldn't touch yourself, or
so I guess I have to caveat that a little bit with, like Steve said, where do I feel like I'm no longer in my lane? Then I need to have some help. And what's cool about the vintage watch community is that there's a lot of people out there to give you a hand. Like Josh was talking about the newbies that jump on. Usually say, "Is this watch legit? I just bought it." And we're like, "Why are you doing this now?" And usually, a lot of times the answers are, "No,
it's fake."
Yeah, it's like, that's the dial doesn't belong with the case back, so you're
usually a
lost.
Franken.
You got a Franken, but it's what's beautiful about I don't know about Seikos. Let's say anything post-war Seikos are that they're pretty. You can get an understanding, and there's enough of them around. Again, like Hamilton and others. You can get the parts if you need to. You may make some mistakes, and there are some very expensive ones out there, like the one I just showed you. What those legit ones only show up about once or twice a year. So if you want one, they're gonna go. I got very fortunate. I picked mine up from one of the forum members in Italy during COVID, and he needed them loaded, and so I actually able to get it sent to my watch restorer who lives in the UK from Italy during COVID, and then he had to spend some time on it. But the point is that I guess the only thing I would say is if you're going to get into early Grand Seiko and early King Seiko, you really need to know what you're into, because with the popularity, especially of modern Grand Seiko, the vintage Grand Seikos are $1,500, $2,000, maybe more, depending. The early Olympic watches that Seiko did, incredibly popular, very expensive, but you got to know what you're buying to know if it has the right hands and that sort of thing. So for a vintage Seiko, I would say I can't think of anything other than you need to have the right person who understands those specific model lines and the specific movement types that go in the right model lines for the higher end Seikos. One of the things I want to do eventually is I want to get a pre-moon Speedy. I really like to get one with 321 movement. That's on my list eventually. Am I going to go that? Yeah, am I going to go that alone? No. That's an expensive and perilous journey. But I will, consult the right people. I'm going to get Moonwatch only. Spend the money for that book, and really understand it, because I have a couple Speedies, but they're modern. But I don't want to engage at that level, because there are people that have been doing this for decades to know what you're supposed to get and what you're not supposed to get. So, yeah. Anyhow, that's my thoughts.
Dave, I know you collect all sorts of vintage watches, and then you have a go at repairing them, don't you? Is there any that you've bought and you've immediately regretted it, or do you normally find that you can get them working to some level?
The Citizen was probably the most difficult. It's very hard to find. I've now had 5 of them, and I have 2 of them working. The one I'm wearing is actually a very nice condition case that I found,
So cool.
with a nice dial from another watch, and dial and handset from another watch, and then but the problem with these is the subdials and the subdial gear, and the pin off the subdial gear breaks. When you click the reset, it jerks back really hard, and the subdial hands will break right off as you're doing that. And those little subdial gears are very hard to find. They only made them for a couple of years, and they're very difficult. So I wouldn't recommend it. I wouldn't recommend anyone attempt an early Citizen chronograph for any reason, unless you're willing to. Even the parts pieces are $300 now. So unless you're going to spend $1,200 on literally a pile of parts that you're never going to be able to use again, you're just going to sell to somebody else as a pile of parts, and they can dig through them. That's what you got to be willing to do. But I always say, when you're starting with vintage, to start with some good simple movements, and go from there. I just wanted to show this to Todd. It's an early.
Oh yeah,
Is
it's
that
an Actus.
It
Is that a
is
5 Actus?
Oh, that's awesome.
Yep.
on the
That is
original
awesome.
band.
I have.
So,
I have.
I
Hold
love
on.
these.
Hold on. You mean something like this?
Yes.
Ooh.
Twins.
Yes, exactly.
This is the
Oh,
SS.
they're cool.
It's for stop seconds.
Yep.
That's what the SS stands for. And this is also, like you said, on the original band. If I can think backwards here, there we go. There's the
there you go.
Seiko 5
That's
Actus.
great.
Yeah, so I'm with you. We're brothers, Dave. There you are.
Wow.
I love it.
We've got a question coming in here. I know, Steve, you've had experience with this, and we have just briefly talked about it. Josh was talking about it, but it was, would anyone on the panel consider a tuning fork watch, either Bulova, Accutron, or Omega, under license from Bulova?
Yeah.
Now, Steve, you've had the Bulova, haven't you? The Space View.
I did, and I've owned like 3 now, and I've sold all of them. but the reason I sold my most recent one is, honestly, and this is one of these things you'll never understand until you own one, is that they emit a hum. The Accutrons have a hum, and it's kind of a high pitched hum. And I would keep that watch in the same room in my office here with me, and it just drove me bonkers. I just could not stand it, and so that's why I ended up selling it. But the other ones I've owned, they've all broken, and then, as Dave mentioned, finding someone to do repair for them is very challenging. So, the good news about these watches is that they tend to be affordable. The bad news is that they tend to be affordable because not a lot of people can repair them, so it limits the collectability value of these pieces. So if you are thinking of going down that road, first off, find someone who can do repair before you even buy anything. find them and say, look, I'm thinking about buying, an F300 Omega or an Accutron or an electric of some other brand. Do you think this is a good idea? Do you have the parts available for them? What does a service or a replacement capacitor typically cost on a watch like this? And is this something I can afford? How frequently am I going to need to have this thing serviced? And, as long as it checks all the boxes, I say go for it. But I think first and foremost, always find someone who can do the repair for you, because there's nothing worse than buying a cool watch like that on eBay and it works for a month or two and then it dies and then you can't get it repaired.
Right. Or do like Josh was suggesting, go to the school of YouTube for a long time and learn how to do it yourself.
Yes.
Because if
Become
you're
an
going to get into
electrician.
vintage watches, you're likely going to need to learn how to do it yourself at some point. Because you can't have, I'm looking at just the ones I keep grabbing off my desk here. You can't own a pile of vintage watches and not know how to do some of the basic service yourself. Simple cleaning, especially when it comes to early electrics, early LEDs. Getting one of these to do that again, you have to know how to get the thing working and some basics. You don't want to have to take one of these to a watchmaker because they're going to laugh at you. So
Right. I jump on the Accutron. I have one. It's almost new old stock I got from somebody off eBay who did re-oiled it, and the Accutron, the tuning fork movement was still working. That's the key, and it works beautifully. It keeps amazing time. I keep it on a soft cloth in my watch box, so it doesn't have that, Steve. It doesn't have that hum coming through the wood and the,
That's smart.
yeah. I just have to cushion it, right? You have to cushion it, but
sound deadener.
Yeah, sound editor. There's a guy I looked up to him before. It's Budget Accutron Service, let's say, for example, and I believe this is the guy that has all the original Bulova tuning fork test equipment, and he knows how to fix them. So to your point, like what Steve was talking about, you got to identify the restorers, like where you can go and get parts, or where you can go and get a watch that has not been frankened. And so as long as that's the case, and there's enough expertise. This guy is in Michigan. There's enough expertise that you can get some things done. I think that's super key. So for example, with my chronographs, I'm not up to, I can do some watch maintenance. I can tear them down a little bit. I'm learning myself. I have my watch desk over there, but I'm not up to the chronographs. They're just, there's enough weirdness, and I don't want to break anything that's worthwhile, of course. And so I'm not there yet, but I have 5 restorers that I use. They're all over the world, and I'll dole out, to them individually when I'm ready to, have one restored, and they'll do the work and, do it right. I know they're going to do it right. They're going to relume properly if it needs to be reloomed, right? They know the right hands, in case I need to replace hands, I can source them and that sort of thing. Like here's a, speaking of rally timers. So this is a 7015 Daini. So this is from Daini Seiko. So this was the two, Seiko was split into 2 companies. It was Suwa and Daini. And this was one of their offerings back in the 70s. And this is actually a rally timer. It's designed to be time rallies. And to your point, you can't see it, but the outer bezel is 30 minutes. So it's designed, visually, and it has an internal rotating ring. And this is a true flyback. So this was designed not to, you'll notice that, I'll just wind it here real quick. There we go. I got to get it just enough to get it to do it. But you'll notice that there's no subdials. Right. But if so here's the reset on it, and then I let go, and it starts timing again. It's a true flyback.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And so this was the, time waypoints and stuff like that. You just push and it would to 0 and you would do it again. Now, I haven't been like Chris and done a lot of rallies, but then you'd use this. I can't imagine sitting in a rally car and doing this, right? But I can't even see it. But you'd use the internal bezel to say, okay, 5 minutes have expired, and now we look for this next checkpoint type of thing. So they built this watch for that purpose. This is actually the Bonham's watch Sam. During you remember
Oh,
the
yeah.
bottom Seiko,
Remember, yeah, that auction, yeah.
the whole
You bid on a
auction.
few.
I bid on a couple. I got a couple because that auction was full of had fakes. Ooh, and you know they let fakes redial and
Allegedly.
allegedly they were, because the whole community that I'm part of sent emails to bottoms and said you have fake watches, but this was one of the ones that wasn't fake, and I was able to grab it. But you know, am I going to work on this movement? When this came out, this was the world's thinnest automatic chronograph movement. It was eventually surpassed, I believe, by Paget about 15 or 20 years later. And so, am I going to work on this? No, I'm not there yet. But I know people that can do it, and that's the key piece for any of these vintage watches.
Yeah, I just want to quickly plug my local watchmaker here, Orlando Watch Company, because they have a tuning fork movement in there, and the gentleman who owns it, when I was chatting to him, says that he knows of the last authorized tuning fork watchmaker. So that might be another option for people. That's Orlando Watch Company. Well, one question I always think of is, we've talked about books, but obviously a lot of research is done online, and we talk about forums. But when you talk about forums, what specific ones are we talking about? Reddit here, or specific websites that have forums on them? I guess, Todd, I'll start with you for Seiko. The forums that you talk about, where do you go to for your information?
Well, other than Casual Watch Talk Facebook group, which is the first place.
the first place.
First place I go anywhere. So, like I may have mentioned in an interview before, I go to. There's a couple. There's Wrist Sushi, which I don't really go on, but it's another one. At one point, there's a political divide between the group, and it's split. But I'm on the original Seiko Citizen Watch Forum. Speaking of vintage citizens, people, you know, have those there too. That's another, like you said, that's a trial. But I go to Seiko Citizen Watch Forum. Some people have been there. Yep, there's Wrist Sushi, yeah, and that's one of them. And you get so many experts there. And it's also a great place to buy a vintage watch, because especially once you hang out on the forums and you get to know some of the people, and then you can see the listings they put up, you can trust that, you know, for the most part, that transaction is going to go correctly, and the watch will be as advertised. And so that's a key thing. But I use I'm there about every day for the Seiko Citizen Watch Forum for my stuff.
Is that Reddit, or Todd, or is it?
It's I can. Hold on here. I'll pull it. I'll give it to you in the chat here, because I think I have it as a quick link. At least I did. But it got bought out by another group, and I'm trying to remember who they are under now. I'm typing here as we speak. The watch site. So it's
oh yeah.
Yeah, it's thewatchsite.com. Yep, there it is.
Okay, so this is separate from Reddit. This is its own self-contained thing.
It's separate from
Reddit.
Interested. Yeah, I kind of stay away from Reddit. I'm not as much of a fan of Reddit forums. But yeah, you know, like there's somebody selling an original wave dial, I guess, and that sort of thing. Yeah.
And I guess Steve or Dave or Josh, where do you guys go for your online research?
I typically go to it's a board called Vintage Watch Forums, and I was just trying to look it up, and I don't know if it's my computer or the site, but it appears to be down right now. VintageWatchForums.com, and they have, you know, specific boards for specific brands, and I'm kind of freaking out a little bit now, because I use them all the time if for nothing else, for identification. Right. That's what I'm getting to. So it must be the website. Yeah. They have you know what? And maybe a couple months ago, I actually pulled the website down and saved it. So I still have my everything I need. But I really, at this point, use it for identification for the years, because they've scanned all of the vintage catalogs, all the vintage catalogs for Hamilton up. So invaluable for identification, invaluable for authentication, you know, the hands and dials and the like. And it's also really cool to look at the old catalogs, and you look at a watch, and in 1942 they sold it for $37 or whatever, and like I paid 5 times that, for a busted watch. But so vintage watch forums is really good, and then also for movements, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right. Ranft, RANFFT .de. It's a database of movements, and it's fantastic. It's a little thin when it comes to Hamilton actual Hamilton movements, but all the ETAs, the Burns, the A Shields, all those Swiss movements that they use. It cross references it. It gives you the amplitude. It gives you the size of the hands. A lot of like sort of esoteric, specific information on a movement. And I use that to to see all of the different calibers that are in the same family if I need to go find parts, right? So I can let me click back there. Yep, that's the one, right? So you can look up whatever movement. Yeah, you click on a movement and it will have have the family on the right hand side over there. That one looks like it doesn't have any, but it'll say like if this had an 1109 and 1108 or whatever, it would all be in the family, and it would describe what the difference is, right? Used a different shock absorber, different bridge material, whatever, it'll tell you what the difference is. And so that's been helpful to find, to help me find parts. And really those are the only two, because Vintage Watch Forums has everything I need, right? And then because of the, we were talking about movements and all that, most of what I have is, mechanical hand wind only type stuff, right? And it's pretty straightforward stuff. So once you kind of figure out how one works, it's not too bad. And I bring it up because there are some sites out there that, for Hamilton specifically, they've scanned the repair manual from 1947. There's one from 1947 and one from 1955, I think. And once you basically understand how the timekeeping side of a watch works, a watch is a watch. Where the differences come in are with the complications. Chronographs. I'm like you, Todd. I'm not touching those. I know my lane, and that's definitely not my lane now, right? But and where the real big differences come in are with all the complications, the dates, the internal rotating bezels, all that sort of stuff. So, but yeah, those are the two sites that I generally go to.
I've never heard of that site. That's fascinating, isn't it?
It is fascinating. And the other thing that I'll bring up real quick, I know I'm sort of rambling here. Hamilton, like a Hamilton 822 is really an ETA 2480 or whatever it is. And so if you know that cross reference, maybe you could maybe you don't have to go buy a broken Hamilton to get the part that you need. You just need to find what else that ETA 2280 went in or whatever. And that Ranft site, helps you, again, I sort of identify what that Hamilton branded movement is based on, and then you can go find it. And there might be one or two Hamilton movements listed on eBay, but then you go find the ETA that it's based on, and there's 1,000 of them, and you could just go buy it, right? Or even buy that new old stock part, if you just need a third wheel or whatever it is.
It's amazing. Steve, where was your sort of weapon of choice online?
Well, I mean, I think one of the things I've sort of taken from this whole thing is that I feel like it's not necessarily what you know, but where to look and who you know.
Yeah.
Because I kind of consider myself a little bit of a generalist, even though I really started with vintage Seiko. But like Todd knows way more than me, so there are times all the time, and Todd can attest to this. I just messaged him yesterday when I have questions about a certain Seiko reference or something that doesn't look right, and I will ask his opinion. I think it always helps, especially if you get into vintage watches, to make a lot of contacts and know where to look. Like that Ramped site, which I've used before, is really excellent. I love On the Dash, which is a Hoyer reference. and it has a lot of the catalog information. So there was a specific model I was looking for the other day that I think was produced in like 1981, 1982, but I wasn't sure. And so, they have every single catalog upload on there. And so I can see, did this only come in a 38 millimeter? Did this come in a 42 millimeter? And like, what movement options did this come with? And so, it's really great to, discover stuff like that and have these as great references. It's also, really beneficial to, accept the fact that you're not going to know everything and have people that you can rely on to give you good information or point you in the right direction. Because, it's just a fact that you're probably just not going to know everything. There's just so much to know, and there's so many different references. And, I've mentioned this before, but vintage watches, the way that they were sold 50 years ago was a lot different than the way they're sold now. And you will see these sub brands like Vantage and Hamilton.
Yep.
You will see certain brands who will sell something in one case and then they'll sell it in 5 different cases, or they'll sell it under 5 different names. And so, I really do feel like it's, if you can find really great resources along with the people that you're talking to, I mean, that really kind of fills in the whole picture and helps out a lot. But I mean, there's a lot of great ones. The watch site I use all the time, as Todd mentioned, Omega forums, Rolex forums. I mean, anywhere and everywhere that I can look, I want to find out as much information as possible, but sometimes it just doesn't exist. So you have to ask around and see if anyone has worked with this type of model before, or they know anything about it.
Yeah. Dave, is there any that you use that we've not mentioned here?
So
Online.
one of the things that I will do is that we haven't really talked about too much was find a part supplier on eBay.
Okay.
Like I've had to do this for electric modules. I've had to do that for certain vintage movements. Like for my Zodiac, I needed a part for my Zodiac. I found a part supplier or a person that was selling a lot of one particular brand. Like this person that I got the Zodiac part from had another watch. It was not a Seawolf, but it had the same movement in it.
Mm-hmm.
So I find somebody that has a lot of a particular brand, and I kind of pick their brain on, what do you think of this? This is what I'm going to attempt to do. Here's the part I'm trying to find. Do you have one? And my James Bond Seiko that I had that we talked about last week. I found a guy in Greece through through one of the websites. I think it was a Facebook page for vintage digital Seikos. It was a digital and LED and LCD Seiko forum, and or it was a Facebook page, and just keep checking, and somebody was selling all these parts. And so that's what I go for, is somebody who's selling a large number of the same brand or the same type of thing, probably has a lot of expertise on that, or at least they've had a lot of hands-on experience. So I'm going to either through eBay or through a Facebook page or a marketplace page or one of the forum pages that has a forum sale page. Like, if I needed a part for, a Speedmaster, I'm going to look for a Speedmaster page where there's somebody who has a lot of them available. They probably know quite a bit about them.
Yeah. That's a good point.
I just want to add one more that I just thought of, because you mentioned your Zodiac, Dave. Instagram, as weird as it sounds, search for hashtags of specific vintage models that you're interested in. I've owned multiple vintage Seawolves, and I have followed people on Instagram that have similar models as me and asked them questions. And sometimes they're not able to answer them, but they actually put me in contact with a really great resource up in Canada. And he's serviced 2 watches for me and gotten replacement parts for me as well. And that all just came about from, searching for a specific hashtag on Instagram. And so I think you can't limit yourself on any specific thing or any specific, way to go about doing things. Like Dave mentioned, like look at eBay and ask people. I always feel like people in this hobby are willing to help each other out. So,
Mhm.
you know, even if they don't know, they'll put you in contact sometimes with someone who does know. And people are really helpful that way, I find.
Right. I'll add one
Mm.
more thing too that's
Oh, yeah.
helpful too, and this would be a good interview too at some point, Sam. But so this is I have two silver dial Seikos, and these are hard to find. And this one was restored, like all mine, by somebody who knows what they're doing. But what you'll see here, what you don't know, is this came from Venezuela, and so I've been getting a lot of watches out of Venezuela
Mhm.
over the last couple years, surprisingly.
Mhm.
It's actually all of them have worked. Kind of like, oh, is this really going to get out of the country? But what I want to show you, the reason why I think it's a good interview is you'll notice the case. This case was polished. A lot of vintage watches get polished cases, and Seiko case design is some of the best in the world, case fabrication, in terms of their lines and their edges and everything. You'll see how much that reflects.
Yeah,
I
it's a
had this
mirror.
case refurbished completely by a guy in North Dakota called Tanner Morehouse. He specializes in Mark II Omegas, especially, you know, the big beefy Mark II Omegas, and he'll do any case, and he laser welds new material onto the stainless, and then he's a lapinist, right? He has a lapping machine. He'll lap it off again, and unfortunately, my computer, I'm trying to get the swirls in here, but they're perfect,
Mhm.
and the
Wow.
edges are just, you can't focus quite, are dynamite. So that's another thing too. So now I'm not afraid. You know, I can find enough of these mid cases sometimes to be okay, but you know, to really get something you really want to treat well and bring it up to maybe what it was like before. You know, he even did the back.
Yeah.
This guy does amazing work. You got to be a little patient, right? Because he's got a backlog. There's a guy in Poland too called the Lapinist who is
Yeah.
well known, and I think he's got a really long backlog. But this guy in North Carolina or North Dakota rather is fantastic.
Brilliant. Well, that's we're coming up to our time now. We've gone a little bit over an hour, but before we finish, just thank everyone for joining me, and then we'll do a few quick plugs. So first of all, head on over to Dave's site at Detroit Mint. Some loving recreations of vintage watches there. Loving recreation of the Citizen that we talked about before. This is in quartz, but Dave will be doing a mechanical, won't you, soon, Dave? I don't know if I was allowed to say
Very
that.
soon. I get the prototypes arrive Wednesday.
Awesome. So head on over, that's Detroit Mint. And then Josh, head on over to Josh's site. This is Wolf Vintage Watches. We can see the vintage Hamiltons that he's been talking about today, some of the new ones he's got for sale. And then also, if you check out the sold watches, you'll see that military one that we talked about. Josh has also got a YouTube channel as well. So head on over there, Wolf Vintage Watches. And then final plug, well, two more plugs. One for Steve for his YouTube channel, quick set date. Although Steve, you need to get
I haven't
on
posted
the
anything
uploader
on there in a long time. I gave up and let you do that because you're the professional, Sam. So.
And then sort of final plug for me, which is, guys, head on over to the Casual Watch Talk Facebook group where you can ask any of us questions after the show. We've got a great little community going on there. And yeah, some really interesting chat that's going on. So just want to thank all my guests for joining me and thank everybody for watching. And that'll be the end of the show. So thanks, everyone. See you next week.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.